educadora, and the founder of La Coalicion, a group of people that I want to express deep gratitude to all of you. You're not all in this room, but you have done an incredible job, and I'm so impressed with all of you. This was a lot of work to do this. And I'm so proud to introduce Estevan as a failed sheep herder. He started out as what happened? Did the coyotes get him or what?
I lost them.
Well, he still had to make a living, so he was forced to become an academic. Which he did with spectacular star success. I mean, his resume is really incredible. I'm so proud because he's ours. He's ours. From 1987 to 1991, he was at the University of Berkeley, where he got his bachelor's. From 1992 to 2000, he was at the University of Michigan, where he got his PhD. From 2001 to 2009, he was the state historian. From 2009 to 2011, he was the director of the National Hispanic Cultural Center.
I'm the one that's grateful. Anita, thank you for inviting me, and thank
Okay, try B now. Yeah, we're working great until we started. Really?
Did you hear it?
Yeah, I heard it great in here. I'm not hearing it now. It's not picking up.
Hello, hello, hello.
Oh, wait. Hey, keep talking.
Hello, hello,
Okay,
hello, hello.
Yeah, there we go.
Hello.
All right.
Okay, it's working. Okay, I forgot what I was going to say. No, I'm kidding. I'm the one that should thank you. Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Daniel, for inviting. I assume that Daniel went to the other room. Thank you, Contessa, for all the help that you did. I mean, the whole group, right? It takes a whole village to actually bring together lectures like this. It really does. And part of it is bringing the juicio into one place, right? Bringing the wisdom. And that, it's not me, actually. So it's you that have given so much to me over decades. I mean, I have my family here, my cousin Reina, Daniel, and it's those communities that have shaped me from the very beginning. Wherever, we often say that it's important to introduce yourself, what place and people you belong to, and that's going to be part of what I say in a moment. But I always want, it's also important, come on, oh wait, I'm jumping ahead. One of the things I learned very early on is to actually acknowledge the land upon which we stand, something that we do in our communities. We say what places and people we belong to. One of my mentors, she's Pueblo, and Rena Swensel always used to say, wherever we go, we leave our breath behind us. And so someone who worked with mud and brought communities together as well, she became one of my dear mentors at some point. And I love this evocation because it speaks to our ancestors, right? Wherever our ancestors have left that breath behind. But it also, for me, speaks to the value of what we do and the breath that we leave for the new generations to come. It's the whole notion of breath has been important to me over the years, particularly more recently, because of how hard it's been to breathe, right? Some of us still having to wear masks during the pandemic, and the whole racial reckoning across the entire globe, because it's been hard for people, particularly marginalized people, to breathe, all right, in the midst of that. So this evocation, it's a universal in terms of thinking of our ancestry, but our responsibility for what we say and what we do. It's also, I've been thinking about place forever. And so when I was invited back into this space, I can't help but think about the power of the Martinez Hacienda. And we're going to talk a little bit about different parts of that, but the different rooms. And I was just in giving an interview for some youth asking me these same questions about the intellectual capital that exists within our communities. But it was remarkable to be sitting in a room with weavings all around us as well. So the creativity that has existed within our communities is important. But all of this stories, what we create with our hands, with our minds, it's also tied to place, right? It's tied to the ground beneath us. It's tied to the built environment, great houses like this that come to exist. But it's people that make those places what they are. I'm going to come back to those names. So just think about those names: Rosario, Francisco Antonio, Juliana, Catarina, Maria Josefa, because that's part of what I want to talk about today, these people and the importance of saying their names. I want to talk about a project that I'm so excited to share with you all today. But every project, just like us people, have origin stories. And for me, that origin story began with places. I grew up, you outed me, and it's true, I did lose sheep, right? And if Daniel and Reina would say he was distracted or something. I probably even lost the water. I didn't mean to, but I was thinking of other things, of the world around me. No, I'm kind of kidding. But I grew up at the base I grew up in at least 2 different villages. At the base of this mountain, and even the names of the geography around us tell stories. This is Montaña de la Yuta, Ute Mountain, which is right in Cerro, and you can see it in Cuesta, but you can see it certainly in the village that was my father's, which is Costilla. And it just stark, but it's a reminder of the people that were once there and the homeland that was once theirs as well. And I grew up with my grandmother as well in a place that came to be known as Cuesta, but it was San Antonio del Rio Colorado, San Antonio, the patron saint of lost things. And then, you know, where I was losing the sheep, I could also look north and see Sinajini, which is also known as Mount Blanca, the White Shell Mountain. And it's one of 4 sacred mountains to the Dene people. It's truly one of the boundaries that define Dineta, the Navajo Nation. So the fact that so I meant to say, in Cuesta, right along, it's divided up that village with a trail that's known as Kiowa Trail. So in the Kiowa are Apache people. So just thinking of the landscape, these stories have meaning. There's a reason why it was called Kiowa Trail and why it's still known as Kiowa Trail to this day. There's a reason why it was called Montaña de la Yuta. There's a reason why this is known as one of the 4 sacred mountains to the Dene people, the Navajo. This is the landscape that raised me up. Just as people raised me, so did places. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. I don't know why that's happening. Messing around. I was raised up with at least 3 stories that has framed what I believe is my entire life. Those of you of a very particular age, some of you are maybe too young, but there was Roots. How many of you remember seeing the syndicated series Roots? You've all aged yourselves. But it was a powerful moment that I don't think that we have fully recognized as Americans yet. How powerful that was in 1977, I think, for Alex Haley to have taken his memoir and for someone to have syndicated it on, at that point, one of 4 channels. It was a powerful moment in which African Americans were able to tell their story of being descendants of African enslaved peoples. But it opened half the American public, which is not true anymore. It's so divided between the 1,000 channels that we watch. Half the American public tuned in day after day to actually watch this. It transformed how we think about race, how we think about slavery, and how we think about the legacy of that. Up until the 1970s, there were less than 3% of African American professors writing their own stories. That's still true today. It's moved to like 5%, unfortunately. Same for indigenous folks and Mexicano, Chicano people as well. So, but at that moment, that man's memoir got played on TV. I can still recite, I can tell you who those characters are. I know that moment when Kizzy was an old woman and went to her former enslaver and gave her water and something else. And so I can tell you those things because I was 9 years old, but I was so impressed. Like that is to say that I was absorbing this. And I fortunately had parents who wanted me to learn about the world. So that was one of the stories that I was absorbing at that point. The other story was, and we have other relatives with us here today, was a story being told by my grandma Nea, Dulcinea Ariano. That's little me right there. I didn't have boots on at that point, but I had my little hat. And my dad, I didn't get to know my dad's mother. She was from Cerro, Idela Martinez, but because she died when I was about that, a little younger than that age. But her mother survived. Her name was Dulcinea Ariano. We went to visit her once a year in Pueblo, Colorado. She told the same story every time we visited her. And we recently found a recording of that was done in the 1980s. And whereas all the other little boys wanted to be out running around, I didn't. I wanted to snuggle next to her. And she had, I forget what it's called, she had a bump on her back. And once I was touching it, my dad said, "Don't do that, that's disrespectful." And she said, "No, I want him to know every part of me." So the physical part, but she was also sharing an ancestral part, the stories. She told of a woman that she could only remember by the name of La India Panana. I didn't know what Panana was. It is Pawnee. She told of this Pawnee ancestor who had been taken away, as she told the story, captured by an enemy tribe, she said, pointing with her lips down south by the enemy. And they had also captured another man who she sometimes called Mexicano, sometimes she called Spanish. And the woman, the India Panana, told the man, "If you take me with you, I will show you how to escape." I love that she had the power. And she escaped, they did. And they ended up in Arroyondo. And then I descend from that mixture. But I was always told this every time that we went there. So I was absorbing this. The second story that I was always told, and anyone who grew up in Cuesta and is a Rael heard these stories of Manuelita Cisneros. Manuelita Cisneros was, as the story went, was taken as a child, Dene, she was Navajo, brought into Abiquiu. But according to one of the stories that was told, she became a weaver and wove. And this blanket that was given to me by my mom, that had been given to her by her dad, had been passed down through those generations. And so I took this with me to college. I took it with me to school. My mom always said, I want you to have this because this says who you are as well. And so now it hangs above my dining room table. When I was a state historian, it hung above my desk as a reminder of this story of Manuelita Cisneros. So those are the three stories that I was raised up with. Because I made this, turned it from a personal project into a professional project, I went on to gather, I developed hundreds of family trees, including sometimes doing my own. This document on the left side here tells the story of Doña Inés. Doña Inés was one of the very first indigenous people from the pueblo of San Cristobal, which no longer exists, was destroyed at some point as part of the Spanish colonial enterprise. But she was taken even before it was settled in the 1580s by a Portuguese slaver who was here on an illegal expedition in the 1580s. And he captured some people, took them back into Mexico City. Doña Inés was one of these individuals. What's interesting is that when Oñate marched back into New Mexico, all of the men were listed in those documents, but all of the European men, but not the indigenous people were not listed, men or women, but one person, Doña Inés. Oñate asked for her by name. Why she was given the honorific of Doña, we don't know, because she likely was only in her 20s at that point. And she, or youngish, we can only estimate. But he also identified her as para trabajar in something like this, as I recall, en voz de Malinche. This is, for those of you who know the story of Malinche, this is a powerful, profound historical connection between New Mexico and Mexico, the initial conquest. Malinche, also known as Doña Marina, Malencin, was the indigenous woman sold into slavery and eventually bought by Cortés, who was conquering Tenochtitlan in Mexico City. And she became a translator, reviled by some, honored by others. There was a remarkable exhibit. I hope you all got to see it in Denver. It's now, I think, in San Antonio. It was in Albuquerque for a while. And it's all about Malinche. But the fact, and there were Malinches, that is, people who were used as objects of the conquest as translators all across the Americas. Doña Inés, that document says, en voz de Malinche, and he was being very clear what he was talking about, to actually come in and help with the conquest. As the story goes, because we have some documents later, she went to San Cristobal, did not know she said that she did not recognize her relatives. I like to think this where interpretation and imagination comes into play, that she refused to participate in the conquest of her own people. But she became enslaved nonetheless and served in an estancia just south of Santa Fe. That's one, and all of you probably, you no doubt, Marcos descend from her. The Martinez's descend from this woman. And many people with different names do. I also descend from a woman, the Arianos descend from a woman who is listed in the 1790 census in Oqueowingue, in San Juan Pueblo, is listed as Josefa, una mestiza. And we're this close to actually connecting her to the woman that she was likely the daughter of. She was there was only one Ariano that was living at that point in all of New Mexico. His name was Cristobal Ariano, a very interesting history in Mexico, generations in Mexico City and in Aguascalientes. But there was one document that I remember going into the archive, pulling out one day. It was Cristobal Ariano fighting for his right to own una pacha llamada, oh my gosh, I'm not even seeing this. How could I have forgot? Margarita. Una pacha llamada Margarita. And he was embattled with Bartolome Lovato, these two men fighting for the ownership of an indigenous Apache woman. Josefa was likely Margarita's daughter. Recently, we traced my mom's matrilineal line back. That is her mother's 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 line. I'm just giving you 3 examples, but it's a remarkable story. In the 1750 census for Santa Fe, which is this document on the left, very, very first page of that census, their censuses are called the padrones, and the very first family, there are 3 indigenous individuals listed, including one listed as simply India Antonia. My mom, Reina's direct matrilineal ancestor traces back to that woman, Antonia, listed in one of the wealthiest households in all of Santa Fe, where there's one document where Garbizu bought a house for 60 pesos y una India. She was likely one of those purchased in that way. So if people say this wasn't slavery, that wasn't about ownership, I can show you billions of documents otherwise. I went on to write my doctoral dissertation about this subject and use documents like this. Those of you connected to the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado, I'm jumping from the 1500s, the 1700s, all the way to 1865, which is mostly what I wrote about, that time period where the entire United States had fought a war over the issue of slavery. And they actually sent individuals, including the Vice President of the United States, Foster, to actually do interviews throughout New Mexico. They started in Las Cruces and went all the way up into Taos and beyond. They interviewed 70 individuals. They were trying to find the causes of the Indian Wars. And it was very clear what the causes were. people were being taken and captured and taken as captives and held in households. So when President Lincoln was assassinated, and the most unlikely of presidents emerged from that, one who would be impeached, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson actually, he proclaimed that this cannot continue to happen, and asked all the Indian agents, that is, agents assigned to tribal communities throughout New Mexico and Colorado, to end this practice of captivity and slavery. All of the Indian agents from New Mexico were silent on the matter. In fact, they justified it. This is not slavery, it's our custom. We capture people. They actually wrote that, it's our custom. One agent, and I argue because he had a political stake in the game, by the name of Lafayette Head in Costilla and Conejos County, created a list of 149 individuals, went into all these towns in the San Luis Valley and the edges, like he interviewed people in Costilla, for instance, and he identified the name, this document, you can't see it here, but it's one of the most remarkable documents of slavery in the United States of America. Particularly at that time, because we do not have census-like listings of any enslaved people. So the fact that those columns, the first column is the name of the owner, his term, the name of the Indian, the tribe, who they were taken from, he uses the term purchase, who they were purchased from, where they were purchased, when they were purchased, whether or not they had children, and whether or not they wished to return. I did family trees. That's what I do. That's what I did back then. I created family trees for every one of those. And of course, the only ones missing from this were those 7 individuals that were in Lafayette Head's household. He conveniently left them out. I created at that point a database I used a family tree software to actually create databases of all of these individuals, because I actually had to organize it. I was working with hundreds and hundreds of individuals. So you can't see it, I'm sorry. This, can I move from this just for, I can point. I think actually this is a pointer. One of these was a pointer. The document on the left is actually the family tree of Antonio Severino Martinez and his wife, and their children are listed under there, but I asked you to remember those names. In this house, he held 3 individuals captured: Maria Guadalupe, Maria Gertrudis, and another one listed as Maria. But the entire family, the network of family, held enslaved individuals. This is what I was doing. I wanted to see how everyone was interrelated. Without thinking about it, I was creating kinship networks for both the enslavers and the enslaved. So the next household over is Padre Martinez's himself, and he held 3 individuals in his household. And the next one is one of those individuals who had been captured along with her child, Rosario and Soledad. And we have someone in the audience who is a direct descendant who I've had the pleasure of working with over these years. And I'm just so honored that you've continued to work with me. Novella. This photograph is Novella's great-great-grandmother, Rosario Romero. And that is her grave marker as well. And I can talk for another hour about Rosario and her daughter, Soledad, who Novella also descends from. All of these were remarkable stories. I was not just a genealogist, I was organizing this data. I'm a trained ethnographer and an anthropologist and a historian. So I was, or otherwise known as an entremetido. That's what I was doing. So that's what historians do. Now I want to talk about, oh my gosh, I could talk forever. So at some point, someone has to like cut me off. I want to talk about this remarkable project. This is what I've talked about to now, and I could continue, is context for what has led me to this moment. I wake up these days, I've had a remarkable career, complicated, complex, politicized, wonderful. I've been able to work in glass houses in Connecticut, the Rockefeller Estate in New York City. I've worked across this nation in working with remarkable teams, but I was born to do this project. I was born to do this project, and I know that. I feel it in my bones, not just because of the stories that I've started to share early on, but because I've been thinking about this project literally for decades. I feel it calling me. And not everyone in life is able to do that sort of thing, get to a point where they like work on whatever they get to work on. I think you're that way, right, Anita? To be able to work with, to build things and paint things and create things. Well, that's where I am with this project. So what is this project? So it's called Native Bound, Unbound, Archive of Indigenous Slavery. We're reimagining the archive. The colonial archive was created by all of the European forces. And those of you who have been watching the news over the past couple of days, you've no doubt noticed that the Vatican has repudiated the doctrine of discovery. There were whole sets of laws and policies and from the Vatican are called papal bulls that actually created this world of colonial enterprise that said you can own that land that is not yours. You can take it, and if there's resistance, you can take it by force. I have to pull myself in because I could talk about that a long time too. But there were papal bulls that said you can own those people and take them as long as it's in the Just War Clause. But so there are archives throughout the world. The Portuguese engaged in this, the Spanish engaged in this, the Dutch engaged in it, the British, the French, and the American. All these empires that created these so-called civilizations and democratic enterprises, actually at the heart and the foundation of that was, I would argue, slavery. But and many of these enterprises, they were great archivists and documenters. The Spanish documented everything, and that's to our benefit. So we are digitizing those, and I'll say more about that, but we're reimagining what an archive could be, reclaiming the archive that was not created for women, for children, for the enslaved. We're recreating that. So who is it that we're focusing on? I just threw some photos here, and of course here's a photo novella of Soledad in the middle here, and another of Rosario's sons, and Delomina Maxwell, Juan Carson, Juan de Dios Gallegos. I could have pulled any number of baptisms because the document that I have here is Maria Rita Gallegos from Abiquiu. And it's a remarkable document. Let's see, I have them here, I could read them. 7 años de la tribu de Navajo, que es la propiedad de Ramón Córdoba. So this whole there's an argument that is often made that this is different than chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is property. It's a legal term. Chattel is property. There's a document that says she's property. She's owned by. I also use last wills and testaments to actually document this, where people are being willed from generation to generation. We just posted on our social media this Inuit man, this one drawing. It's an etching, a man who was taken captive from Canada in the 1500s, 1577, if I remember, taken to London. He would last 3 days. In the struggle to capture him, he bit his tongue in half. But he was paraded around London as a captive. His likeness was presented before the Queen Elizabeth. So this is an international project. That drawing, there's a painting. It's about this small in a huge mural that was painted by the Borgia king, Borgia Pope. Sorry, he thought he was king. And he was the one that released the papal bulls around indigenous slavery and divided the world in half and said, Portugal, you own this part, Spain, you own this part. I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek, but all of what I'm saying is factual. There was a mural done of the 6 indigenous people who were captured from the Caribbean by Christopher Columbus in 1490s. And in 1495, he took about 12, only 6 survived the journey across the Atlantic. So the transatlantic slave trade actually began with indigenous bodies being taken across to Europe. There was a mural that was commissioned by the Pope, and it had been covered up until, I think, the 1870s. It's been revealed, but if you look really close, because it's probably, I imagine it the size of that wall, but if you imagine the size of this painting by this very famous Taos artist, the size of this painting in the midst of that wall, that's that there, and it shows 5, 6 indigenous people in the background. That's probably the first graphic illustration of indigenous enslaved people that was ever made. That's what this project is about, these people. Where is it that we're focused? I often say, because I'm crazy, we're not just focused here local, regionally, across the United States. It's a hemispheric project. We've already started to build a team from Argentina all the way up into Canada and Alaska. So it's a hemispheric project. When is it that we're focused? You've already heard me mention Christopher Columbus lands in 1492. We're interested in that moment. He takes these 12 individuals, but a couple of years later, he boards 500 individuals who are taken to Spain. All of these people taken from the Caribbean. And so it devastates that time. So 1490s all the way to, I've traced individuals all the way into the 1950 census who are still being listed as servants in their household. Did I warn everyone that this is tough stuff? This is really hard history in many ways. Should have warned you. So it's a long time period. People, even though I mentioned that 1865 document, there was a whole effort to eradicate slavery, but it didn't work. 1868, there was a whole effort. They tried through military courts. Then in 1868, they tried through, the military. They tried through the military. 1868, a few years later, they tried through the courts, legal mechanisms. They hired this man by the name of William Griffin, who came into Taos, Santa Fe and Rio Arriba counties, and interrogated people who were still holding slaves in 1860s. He identified hundreds of men and women in Taos. I did the family trees on all of those as well. And didn't end there. Those same people continue to serve as servants in those households years later. Okay, I think I need to move a little quicker, right? Probably. Okay, how are we doing this? Someone needs to nod to me and say about 10 minutes or something.
So it's 6:35 right now.
Okay, so we have until 8, right? Like I have you all.
We're captives.
Right, you're captives. Lock the doors. Put on the locks.
Well,
Okay.
we can have a Q&A too.
Okay, no, I will. We will do a Q&A. I promise. I'll move through this next part.
When do you want me to cue you at the next time spot?
Cue me when we have, what, about 20 minutes left? Is that, so that's Q&A? Okay, so how are we doing this? Not an easy project to actually do. I've built a team. I've created guideposts for the team to work off of. So when they ask, like, I'm looking at these documents, what am I looking for? Because there's lots of, slavery was illegal in 1542 under the Spanish Empire, but it continued. So I'm saying, okay, you're not just looking for the term esclavo, you're looking for criado, sirviente, even peón. You're looking for all of this terminology. So we've developed a robust terminology to guide my team for what they're looking for in the documents. We've started to do, I can't even read these little documents, but we've created tons of back-end information to guide the team in terms of what they're looking for. The team has started to go to archives. This Felisa, who's from Ecuador, she's actually a graduate student from the University of New Mexico, but she happened to return to her home in Quito, where she's actually went into the National Archives and started to look at the records. Samuel Cisneros at the University of New Mexico going through documents. Some people like Daria and Sonia are actually looking online, just mining all those records because so much has now been digitized. We're one of the incredible partnerships at the University of South Florida. Michael Francis he's in Spain doing work, just gathering records. So and this is just a glimpse at the team. Line by line, we're gathering names, just names, going through all the baptismal records. In New Mexico, it's fairly easy. You open up any baptismal record, any baptismal book, any page, you'll find an enslaved person. India, criada de, en la casa de, sirviente de. And we're gathering, and it's, for me, I'm familiar with this region, but I've not been familiar with places like Colombia or Peru or Brazil. I'm learning so much in terms of what the team is bringing, but they're also creating these same spreadsheets. This is one in Montreal, a team member working in Canada, Montreal. One's from Brazil, one's from Belen. We're working with scholars. There's a whole body of scholarship that has actually developed around this. I have not finished my book because the past 20 years I've actually been working as a cultural administrator, but the book is still there because it's still important to me. But then I started this humongous project. So, but we're gathering these scholars. Not everyone accesses information through scholarship and through a book. That's why I believe so much in this particular project, because it changes the equation for who has access to this knowledge. And I'm going all kinds of places, working, building collaborations. That's me at the New York Public Library. So we're building collaborations everywhere. We are, as if this project isn't complicated enough geographically, we're transcribing every single record because I believe in not just access, but accessibility and people understanding these records. You'll be able to see the digitized record, so you can check if, like, is he typing that correctly? We're transcribing it. So we've built a team of transcribers that are now global, that are working everywhere and led by my deputy, Dr. Aaron Taylor, a professional transcriber translator, and he's built a team of transcribers who are working both as volunteers and some who have come on board. So if there are any Spanish teachers out there, Portuguese teachers, people who know French, we need your skills. Some of these folks are just everyday people like Pat Raul Sanchez, who those of you who do genealogy will recognize her. She's just going through those records because she's worked with them so long and working at her computer. Dr. Canela Guillaume is at the University of Leeds. He's also working in Paraguay, and so he's doing all kinds of wonderful gathering for us. Okay, the technology part of this. We are working with some of the best technologists, programmers to help us realize a very complicated project because we're not just transcribing, translating, but we're coding all the names. So when we find a name like Rosario, and we find a baptismal record, we want to find the census records and the death records and a photograph and an oral history by a descendant. All of those have to be connected to the back end. Otherwise, the job falls on you to connect them. We're going to connect them for you because there's magic with the technology. We've launched a social media campaign, so follow us at NAT Bound, it's up here, NAT Bound Unbound. And we're just giving you glimpses, not just at the trauma of this and the tragedy of this, but the resilience of individuals who survive this and leave descendants behind. Okay, why are we doing this? This will be, once we launch this, and it will be a project in process for decades, no doubt, because this is so huge, unless we have sign you all up today, which is part of the plan, for you to work at least 5 hours a day on this. But it's going to be accessible to educators. It was really interesting listening to some of the students earlier saying, we didn't learn about this in New Mexico. Because I had just said to her, to Maya, that this is a foundational story in our, not just our local history, but our nation's history. And she said, but I took New Mexico history last year and I didn't learn about this. And I said, well, this is why we have to do a project like this. So we can help educators. We're going to help other scholars. God, I wish I had had a project like this. It would have helped immensely. Storytellers. Artists. We're working with a dance troupe who want to work with us right now, even before the project is created. Artists who can paint these things, right? Paint the resilience from the communities. We want to make this accessible. But when the president of the Mellon Foundation, who is a poet, which is why I think she believes in this project, asked me, Estevan, who are you creating this project for? We're recovering these stories for descendants, for descendant communities. And sometimes we know, sometimes we've been lucky, like I've been fortunate, like I was fortunate to hear oral histories, right, of Manuelita or La India Panana. But not everyone knows that. In fact, the vast majority of people probably don't know that they're connected to these stories. They just, but if you give me your family tree, I will find them. Right there. At some point, hyperbole in my dissertation, I wrote, there's not a single New Mexican that does not descend from an enslaved indigenous person. Now, I was not boasting, I was basing that on a calculation of like the fact that there's so many across so many generations that it was inevitable for that to happen. Now, what's going to be interesting about this project is that the detail is going to be there, right? We're going to be able to show that everyone that was listed in every single baptismal record, marriage record, all of those. So we're doing this project for the descendants. In fact, this week we launched the collaboration with StoryCorps, which is recording those conversations. We had a couple here that were recorded, thank you, Novella, and in Taos. We have 7 that are being done in Santa Fe and about 12 that are being done in Albuquerque. We're going to launch this at a national level as well, but that's who I really want to hear from, those stories to help us connect from the ancestor all the way down to the descendant. I'm going to stop right there and entertain any questions that you have or thoughts.
Can I make a request?
Yes.
When someone asks a question, would you
Repeat
repeat
it?
their question? That would be wonderful.
Yep.
So we're going to take questions. We have a mic that can be passed around so that you can be heard. We're also going to bring in questions from the overflow room. So we'll take turns going back and forth between the questions from the overflow room and this room, okay?
Okay. Yes, sir, in the back.
Did Mellon help you funding for all of these?
Well, that's the other thing I'm going to ask you for. No, I'm kidding.
Lock the doors again?
I have no, yeah, lock the doors. Yes, the Mellon Foundation has funded this project for 3 years at 1.5 million. It's a lot of money, I recognize, but it's not enough for the vision that I hold. So, but they believe in it. So the Mellon Foundation has funded this project. Yes, sir.
The map that you have up there, is this a local map?
Ah, thank you for asking about this map. This map was created because I didn't fit it in. This map was created by one of New Mexico's top map makers, Bernardo Miera y Pacheco, who left many descendant Mieras in the Taos Valley. And so he was a professional map maker and obviously a very gifted illustrator. And this particular map, there's so much, I could give a whole lecture on this particular map. This one is at the British Library. A lot of our patrimony is everywhere else. But it lists the Laguna de los Timpangos. This is Ute territory. There's indigenous places and spaces listed throughout the map, but there's also a narrative. I've kind of obscured it with the word Unbound. I'm going to point to it. It's right there. There's a little bit of a narrative of the Comanche attack that took place here in Taos, where some other ancestors of people were actually taken away as captives. Maria Villalpando was one of those individuals, a very prominent, who was listed as a criada in that Romero household. She was taken in a very long, complicated history to her life. She would end up in St. Louis, Missouri, and holding enslaved people herself. This is a complicated narrative. Thank you for asking about the map. Anita.
Esteban, because we can't find the mic,
Oh.
could you repeat questions when you get
Yes,
them?
I'm sorry. I was asked to do that and I didn't do it. So,
So
yes.
for the purposes of recording, we have
Yes.
to say we have the question that you're speaking to.
Yes. So someone asked me, I'll repeat it afterwards, about this map. So I just talked about that. Anita,
I
what is
know
your...
that the Comanches raided and captured slaves. How widespread was slavery among indigenous people? And what was their participation in capturing and selling slaves?
The indigenous slave trade across the the question was how widespread was indigenous slavery by indigenous peoples themselves, capturing and enslaving people and trading them. So indigenous slavery was happening even before 1492. People were being captured and bartered for different reasons. It's not my expertise. We'll bring in experts to actually trace that a little bit. Some of that is recorded in some of the codices of Mexico, some in the archaeology. But I will say that the Europeans perfected it. It catalyzed to an extent that the Americas had never seen before when the Europeans brought it in. There were, even in the Taos Valley, to make it a little bit more local, it was a multi-way trade, right? The Utes were capturing Dene people along the Long Walk. They were selling them. The Comanches were capturing Hispanic people and other tribes. The Dene were capturing all kinds of people. The Dene, the Navajo. That's why to this day there are clans. The Nakai clan, for instance, is a Mexican clan. Those were Hispanic people, Mexican people that were being captured, taken into the Navajo Nation, and they became a whole clan. So it was a multi-way trade. Based on my research, at least in northern New Mexico, for every one Hispanic person that was being taken away from New Mexico, there were 30 indigenous people being brought in. So that, again, part of what this project will do is give that detail to this. But here, let me be clear with what the project is all about. To the extent that we find and record any evidence, whether a document, archaeology, or otherwise, Our interest, excuse me, is any indigenous person who has been displaced from their own community, placed into another community.
Estevan, these
Yeah,
are
I can read
questions
these.
from the other room.
Sure.
If you want to go back and forth
Sure.
between one of those and one of these.
Can you talk about the Genízaro communities of New Mexico? So you've noticed maybe that Genízaro has taken on, it's a movement. And now people are identifying as Genízaro. I'll explain what that is. The origins of the term Genízaro go all the way back to the Ottoman Empire. They were called the Janissaries. They were shock troops. They were Christian boys who were being taken captive into the Sultan's army and were being used as enslaved people basically under the Ottoman Empire. How that word traveled, but I suspect there was lots of trade between the Ottoman Empire, that whole region, into Spain. So the word probably traveled there in terms of what it meant. It traveled into Mexico. It becomes a caste category. That is to say that depending on a caste category is basically Indian woman marries Spanish man. What is born of that is a mestizo. A mestizo marries with Lobo, another caste category. Morisco is born of that. There were whole caste categories. In New Mexico, we didn't have as many castes. They're complicated castes. We had mestizo, we had Lobo, we had color quebrao, color revuelto, color, there's another color. So we didn't have as many as there is thought to be in Mexico. One of these categories, another term, was Genízaro. So somehow it ended up here as a term that we continue all these years later to grapple with how to define it. Because sometimes Genízaro communities are being called those people who themselves were captured from various tribes. I'll give you a case in point. 1733, there was a petition made by about 24 individuals who petitioned the governor to actually occupy the then vacant lands of Sandia Pueblo. Whole other story in terms of why they were noted as vacant, but they applied to occupy, and they signed Los Genízaros. But they also signed their tribal names, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, all of these names, and tribal groups. So these were people who themselves had been captured and displaced, and at some point freed. And they were able to establish their own communities. The mid-1700s, there were several communities that were established as Genízaro communities. One was Belén, one was Abiquiu, San Miguel del Vado. So they were formerly enslaved people who the governor set up as communities themselves. Those communities there was a political move to set them up as buffer zones to protect the colonial center. But here's what happens when you try to do something like that. There's all kinds of mixture. So all of these places mix. So anyway, I'm digressing about what Genízaro was. What's interesting is that Genízaro, you can give me more, but Genízaro ends up being not just those original captives, but even their children are being listed as Genízaro. So what we're going to try and do is decipher that. Okay, how many of them are children that are being named that? So that's what this project will do as well. Is there a question from here? Yes.
Sir, could you talk a bit about your knowledge about Butte Mountain and how it got its name?
You know, it's a question I wish I knew the answer to. I don't, unfortunately. And which is a shame because I grew up right in the shadow of it. I've always just mused or suspected it was part of the Ute homeland. It was known for the Ute homeland. And I'm guessing that the settlers who would settle in places like Ostia knew that that's where the Utes were, right? So I'm sorry, that's the only answer I have for that. Okay, this one is a very long one. How can I help? Oh gosh, I've already said that. Is there a need for someone to create historic vessels? I don't know what historic vessels are, but I'll think about that, because whoever asked this question, come and see me later. It's in the other room. Let me ask another one from this. Esteban, I'm looking for my 3 times great-grandmother, Josefa Lucero. Thank you for coming. Born in 1835, my great-grandfather Benigno Cárdenas Hernandez described the Lucero family as wanderers from the Canadian river country. Any idea of what he meant? Did he mean that they were Genízaro? Well, this is a sort of question that I would actually have to go into my database to actually find Josefa Lucero and the grandfather Benigno Cárdenas to see if I can find more information about them. But because it's a very specific kind of question that I don't think I can fully answer now. So whoever asked this come and see me. Is there another one from here? Yes, sir.
Predominantly, the database is from like the archdiocese, are you saying? Is that predominantly most of that information? Because we did have our courthouse burned down. Would any of that information been lost or recorded at that time when it was Spanish territory, the empire?
The question is if the records that we're working with are predominantly from the archdiocese or from church records. I suspect that it's going to be a large percentage of our type of records. I'm going to go through a couple of types of records, because in church records, we have the baptisms, we have marriages, we have burials. In some places, we have catechism as well, or confirmation rather. But the baptisms, I think, are going to be even the biggest bulk of any type of record that we're looking for, even within that subgroup of church records. But we're also working with civil records or criminal records that are held in state records center and archives, that are held in county records, so probate records. It's amazing what we've been able to find in probate records. Just because novella caught my eye, just before Padre Martinez died, and this was before 1868, when there was a whole effort to actually interrogate all those former owners, he went to the probate court and actually petitioned to make Rosario to make himself the guardian of Rosario. So those records, which used to be county records, are at the state archives now. But we are looking at what are often called notarial records in Mexico. We've just brought on 2 researchers from Toluca and from Mexico City. So they're looking at municipal records, they're looking at all kinds of records. We are hoping not to leave a single stone unturned. Okay, let me ask here. These are long questions. Let's see, I'll do this. How do I speak respectfully about my place here, my family as an Anglo both in this state? I'm also proud to be from here. My half-sister's grandmother is unknown. How do we find her history? How do I speak respectfully of my place here? One of the things that I learned along the way, someone taught me that the best storytellers are those who learn how to listen. And so sometimes listening is a sign of respect, right? So listen to the stories that are around you. And that's true of any one of us, regardless of our background. But if you, since this person put it out there, if you're new to this state and you want to learn these histories, many of you are doing that. You're listening to those around you. Listen to your neighbor. Ask them, where does that story come from? Tell me about that word. So in terms of the second part, my half-sister's grandmother is unknown. Well, here's what's happened with places like, or online sites like Ancestry or Family Search. It's blown up, right? I mean, people are looking for their ancestry, and it's become easier. You have to be a little bit more careful with Ancestry, because those of you who have used it, there's like little hints, a little leaf that wags. I don't know, leaf wag, but that you have to be careful, because it will give you a hint that may not be accurate. So you have to really think about these things critically. But that's one way. We all come from somewhere. We all have ancestry, and that ancestry tells us a little bit about who we are. Marcos.
Common question. It's, we are people of my generation, which there might be a few of you here. We grew up watching television and basically the romanticization of colonial enterprise in the U.S., glorification of the slave owners, and colonization. And it seems as time has gone on, history, the whole enterprise of history is taking this other aspect of, it's no longer looking at from the top down, from the bottom up. There's a book, 400 Years of White Trash or something like that. You know the book I'm talking about?
I do.
It's very well researched. It's all about white people, right? I read the first 60 pages, and I was fascinated that, because one of the things, having lived in the East and been around people, it's like, I was amazed that it's like, wow, seems like thousands of people came out of the Mayflower, because everybody's taking credit for that. And one thing she talks about is everybody wants, there's a really deep hunger in Americans for status, to be somebody. But what she describes in the book of the people that they were bringing just from England, never mind the other countries, were basically, they were literally collecting beggars off the street, throwing them on boats, all the undesirables, and bringing them here. And I think from what I can capture, the New Mexican version of that is that everybody here is Spanish. Nobody's Native American. No. And it's like, years ago, to suggest that would be, those were fighting words. And now it's all of a sudden, it's like, with Ancestry.com and these other sites, it seems like people are beginning to see something more, I don't know, something more truthful.
It's hard. It's going to be hard to repeat that. But Marcos Martinez just actually opened up a really wonderful conversation about the fact that we've learned so much of our history top down rather than bottom up, right? It's the elite that we know, right? The lions, what is the saying? The lions don't write the history, right, of the hunt, right? And the servants, the women, none of those people in those early records, they're not writing history. We don't get the history of children. We superimpose that. We don't know from their perspective what is happening. And that's certainly true of how we think about who makes history in globally, in the United States or otherwise. We think of the presidents, of the popes, and they're the ones who are commissioning people to write those histories. But I want to know about Sally Hemings, right? We've started to interrogate these things. We think of our founding fathers as we hold them up high. They created a democracy that is untouchable. But I think that we have to be critical. I'm trained to be critical of thinking of those things. So when I mentioned Sally Hemings, she was the African enslaved person in Thomas Jefferson, one of countless, they counted them, many individuals in Thomas Jefferson's estate, as was George Washington. So these founding fathers, even as they espouse principles of freedom and democracy, they were, as all of us are. Identity, Eduardo Galeano has written, identity is no museum piece sitting stock still under a piece of glass. We are the endlessly astonishing synthesis of the contradictions of everyday life. And that is as true of Padre Martinez as it is of Thomas Jefferson, but it's all the more important to learn about those histories of the people who have been marginalized in those epic stories. I'll finish this here about this. I was raised by a farmer and a school teacher. Those two types of roles are they're seasonal. There's nothing remarkable. I think there's something remarkable about them, but there's nothing remarkable. You plant your crop, you harvest the crop. Plant the crop, harvest the crop. Plant it, you bring in the sheep, you have a new crop of sheep, right? All of that, it's rote, and there's nothing remarkable. But anyone who has gotten to know my dad, this 95-year-old man, who is remarkable, he's a remarkable man whose story deserves to be known. So I think of him as remarkable as any governor in this state, or anyone who, Padre Martinez, who brings in the printing press. Absolutely, we need to know that. But we also need to know Rosario's story, right? So I can preach on.
I have one
Yes.
question. And is it possible, like there was this gentleman in my childhood who worked for my grandfather. And he was tall, very native looking. All he was missing was the feathers. And you remember, Gipe, right? And I thought, Gilberto, yeah. And I thought, when you talk about the descendants of people who were slaves, he came to mind immediately.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, would it be possible to find out his trajectory?
Yes, we're doing that. So a lot of individuals, chances are, if you thought that, he probably was, right? And so Gilberto, if you just give me his last name, I'll find him in the census record. Chances are he's being listed in the census record as Pion. And from there, we can actually trace, well, who were his parents, if we can find them, right? So, but that's precisely how we do this work. We start it name by name. But if there's a sense of that, it's probably accurate.
It was like unspeakable. You wouldn't say that.
Yeah, we didn't. It was disrespectful, actually, to talk about those things. So, let me see. Is there another one? How are we on time? Are we like way past time?
One more question? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have
Anybody
a
else?
question as well.
Let's go here and then here.
Contessa.
I was hoping you could speak a little bit to folks from northern New Mexico, southern Colorado who have century-long lineage here. I was hoping you could speak to the tendency to identify as Spanish versus Native versus Mexican, especially being that they were here prior to the border having moved, and kind of where that comes from or what that might be about.
The question is, if I could speak about the whole notion about how people start to identify as Spanish versus Native from northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, right? In terms of the various, and the impact of the historical occurrences, like the U.S. occupation of the northern part of Mexico, and when the border moves, right? So is that accurate? And it ties a little bit about what you brought up, Marcos, but I always like to contextualize it. It's true that people, even to this day, identify as Spanish. And how they do that without thinking. I mean, it's how many people grew up. But there's a reason for that I think has to do with, dare I say, supremacy, a little bit of the white supremacy that was happening in the early 1900s. They erased erased those histories, erased Gilberto's background, erased your background, erased those things, so that we started to, think about post-1848. U.S. has been occupied and taken in an illegal war, right, in northern Mexico, and people want to belong. I mean, part of it is that there was, New Mexico was in part isolated, not as isolated as people thought it was, but from the Spanish courts, Mexican government, but then it would also continue to be isolated by the U.S. government. Tangent there, but the fact is that after 1848, people were still wanting to belong to something, and we were denied the status of full citizenship for over 60 years, kind of like what has happened to Puerto Rico, right? And because of that, there was a political consequence to that denial. It meant that the President of the United States during those 60 years could actually appoint all top officials, governor on down. This is related to this, I promise. But so during those 60 years, people wanted to belong and had to prove their sense of belonging. And so there's a political context in which this is taking place. Then the artists come in and say, the writers, Mary Austin and others, and say, you guys you're not Mexican and you don't descend from indigenous. No. You guys are the golden age of Spain. You are Spanish. And they started to spin a narrative early 1900s. And I'm generalizing here because there's a lot of history packed in here, but the generalization of that identity starts then, and then our communities buy into it. And why did they buy into it? Because it makes a better story. It's less messy. They thought would protect them from the racism that they were having to endure. Around that time, early 1930s, 1920s, 30s, 40s, people could go into the San Luis Valley or even further up, and there were signs: no dogs, no Mexicans allowed. So there was real racism on the ground that made people say, I don't want to be that. I don't want to be that. But here's the irony. They were saying, well, I'm not Mexican. And they were like, well, you eat tortillas, you eat beans. You're culturally, you're all of those things. You speak Spanish. A border separated you, but you're kin. You're cousins with those people from Durango, Zacatecas, Chihuahua. You're similar to them, and we don't see the difference, right? And so in spite of but people continue to want to solidify their identity as Spanish. But as I said to the students who were interviewing me, like what I said, identity is not a museum piece. We are not a little piece of pottery or any of those things that say we are much more complex. I like to think of us more like the Russian nesting dolls. We're one inside the other, inside the other, inside the other. So you identify who your parents are, who your grandparents are. It's true. If you want to trace that one line back to Spain, but at the 10th generation, New Mexicans have a tendency to say this all the time. I'm a 20th generation New Mexican. And I say, what does that mean exactly, right? Here's what it means. Again, I'm not making fun of it, but it is incomplete at the very least, because they're tracing one line back to generally that male line that comes from Spain. But if they trace that female line, I guarantee you it's going to end with an indigenous woman. I guarantee you 90% of people who have tested a DNA test, they're coming up with an indigenous woman. But at the 10th generation, we descend from, I'm not going to remember the number here now, but it's like 2,000 individuals. So imagine 10th generation. You invite all of your ancestors into this courtyard. I think about 2,000 would fit there, right? Something like that. Or they'd spill out into the yard. Those are all your ancestors from the 10th generation. And it's like someone who says, I'm this or that, and it could be I'm Apache or I'm Spanish. You're picking one of those. You descend from all of them. You descend from all of them. and a way of honoring that. But I'm especially interested in the ones whose story has not been told.
Is part of, oh, I'm sorry, is your question?
I think you pretty much answered it there. I was gonna ask about, you know, documentation again of Native Americans in the Martinez family, and I'm sure, you know, my grandmother tells me about one of them, but I've never come across any paperwork.
Ooh, I have all the records. No, I don't have all the records, but I have many of the records. The question was, how do you find those? I mean, there's stories that exist in families about these enslaved people who were in the family. There's church records. There's other things, and that's precisely what Native Bound to Unbound is all about. We're going to digitize these. We're going to make them accessible to you and to anyone to be able to find them but we're interested in also working with you. So when I hear you say, my grandmother has that story, that's when I want to lean into you and say, what is that story? Because as we imagine the arc of these individual lives across time, you know, if we have a baptismal record, 2 census records, and a death record, that just gives us a glimpse into their life. We don't know what their daily life was. I mean, peeking into this back room, you know, we don't know they're making their bed every day, going to gather the goats every day, and what that meant, and doing it in a situation where they're being stigmatized, right? So we're interested in all of those stories.
Because being Comancheros and Ranchos also has many stories that go back to all of the Comanches that were swapping children.
Yeah. There's not a single place in this landscape. So this is me arguing with a person who wrote who wrote a dissertation 20 years ago. I focused on those places like San Miguel del Vado, ranchos. They were set up as Genízaro villages or indigenous villages. But here's the reality, now that I know this, I knew it before, there's not a single town in all of New Mexico where there weren't indigenous enslaved people. There's not a single building that has not been touched by indigenous enslaved people's hands. Making the adobes, cleaning the walls, making the beds, all of those things. There was a historian, I was a young historian back then when I came in and started being the state historian, and I said something, I said I want to gather the material culture of all of the enslaved people, and he said to me, there's nothing was created by the enslaved people, which felt not only insulting, but it's actually inaccurate, right? All the ditches were dug. There's not a single church that was not made by indigenous hands. Every wall, everything, and every person who, our hands and faces, even if it doesn't show up in what I say, the geography of our hands and faces, it shows up in our aching consciousness. So it's there.
Most of the hard labor and never received the credit.
Yeah. Anita.
So in this process of enormous mixing and exchange over a long period of time, didn't that in a way constitute the Indianization of our people? Because we were raised by Native women. We were toilet trained by Native women. Generations of us, all the way from Mexico to here.
I've thought about that a lot in terms of, you know, it often says the culture is passed down through our mothers, right? The female lines. And that's, I think it's a generalization. I mean, men can certainly pass down those lines, but I do think that there's something to be said about that. And these women, whether they had children themselves, right? I mean, I think of Rosario's story, the story that was written by Dora Ortiz Vasquez. Dora Ortiz Vasquez was a grandson of Padre Martinez, and she wrote a memoir, The Enchanted Temples of Taos. And it's part memoir, part romanticization. It's an interesting memoir. But one of the things that I think is notable about it, there's a lot of it gets romanticized. but she actually uses the term slave, which was remarkable for someone writing in the 1970s novella. I can't remember when she was writing that, and published it then. So to have used the term slave for it, but the reason I'm sharing this is that Dora was a descendant of the enslaver, and she Padre Martinez. So the enslaver was Padre Martinez, and she was the grandson. Dora was George's daughter, Jorge Romero's daughter, but she's reflecting about the relationship that she had with Rosario, and she talks about it in an intimate way. They had a name for her, Mayayo, that they referred to her. So I'm trying to think about like the influence. So she's so deeply influenced by Rosario's way of life, right? But Rosario also had her own children, right? So these women moving back and forth. But no matter how you dice it, these people who are living in these walls, doing the work, raising the children particularly, deeply influences who the communities are. But that gets erased in the 1900s. Yes, sir.
When you were talking about Hispanic and Mexican, there was also from 1880 to 1900 an accent on being Hispanic because they were trying to become a state, the territory of New Mexico. And they accented Hispanic because on the floor of Congress, the congressmen were saying, "Are you kidding? We don't want any Mexicans." And they used every name you could think of, negative name about Mexicans on the floor of Congress to keep the territory of New Mexico not becoming a state. And so the politicians, especially some of the so-called Anglos, I don't like to use that word because I'm Irish, but anyway, in Santa Fe, started accenting the Spanish like crazy. And in 1912, the Congress learned that, oh, they're Hispanic, they're from Europe, therefore they can become a state.
Yeah, it's true. This point that, what's your name?
Kelly.
The point that Kelly made in terms of the arguments that were being made for statehood, that's why I related it to how people identified, is really important. Calhoun was the senator, if I remember correct, who made that argument, and others joined in the argument. Basically, they are two. The argument made was that they were too Catholic, first of all, and that they were not Indian enough, and they were the worst of. They called them mongrels. Basically, was the word used in Congress. They take the worst traits of each of their races. Is what the art, and I mean, you can pull up those congressional records, and they're filled there. I mean, they were mixed, but the language that they were using was deeply racist. But you're right, it was used to justify why they couldn't be included in the union, right? Yes. Oh, let me ask this one. I'm sorry, I forgot this.
We have a question over here.
Let me ask this one. Would we be surprised to find more Spanish ancestry in tribal Pueblo people to be common in the same way that we find indigenous ancestry in our local Spanish communities? I personally would not be surprised. The colonial experience complicated everything. Everyone was being mixed. That's just the reality of all of these communities. DNA is complicated, but as people are starting, more and more people are doing DNA result tests. They're seeing across these communities. They're finding how interrelated people actually are. Sometimes more than they want to find out about. But The reality is that all of these communities were impacted by colonial regimes. And sometimes that was acts of violence, rape and other things, slavery, and sometimes it was acts of love. I mean, people had relationships within these communities, across tribal communities and cross-culturally. So that's absolutely true. I wouldn't be surprised. Yes.
Yeah, this is, I just wanted your opinion on it. We have very good friends at the Pueblo, and back when my dad was a child, he was a baby, my grandmother got sick and had to be sent to somewhere else to get well. And meanwhile, they took my dad to the Pueblo to someone that could nurse him. But, not these friends particularly, but other people, we call them Indians. We went to school with them. My husband played ball with them, you know. But anyway, they claim they're pure Indian. So what is your opinion on that?
Well, you asked the same question in a way that they just asked, which is, I mean, there's always a draw to claim purity in any community. Sometimes that is because of sovereignty issues, right? So like we are intact. We're not only pure, but we're intact. We are unchanged. But the reality is that colonialism changed everyone, right? So I don't think purity exists anywhere in the world anymore, right? But that doesn't change in tribal communities, for instance, where they get to define their membership and who is part of that and what that means to them. So I think that it's complex in that way.
Are there any more questions?
Yes, let's see. There's if all legacy New Mexicans are descended from enslaved indigenous people, do the DNA tests support this statement? I've seen one test, this is hard to read, DNA evidence point more descendancy from non-New Mexican indigenous people than from indigenous people from the United States. Also, what is the reaction of local indigenous nations to your project? Okay, so there are two questions there. If all New Mexicans descended from the DNA, this person heard me say what I boasted about in my dissertation, that all New Mexicans descend from this. So do DNA tests support that? I've not delved so much in that, but I know the New Mexico Genealogical Society DNA project has actually begun to test people. So that does, DNA doesn't break down into tribes. So our blood does not break down into tribes. It basically gives you what's called a haplogroup or a code. It just gives you a code and tells you where those people are from. So it's either going to say Europe, and it'll give you a place in Europe, or a place it'll indicate that it's Native American or native to the Americas. So just like it doesn't give you a tribe, it doesn't tell us if that person was enslaved. So we don't really know if it supports that. But here's what the DNA actually is saying, that if 90% of people who test a matriarchal line, of those, not everyone is tested, obviously, in New Mexico, but both Pueblo people and Hispanic people who have tested, between 85 and 90% of those who have tested an mtDNA line, the mother's 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 mother, is coming back with a Native American haplogroup. 15% of the males, Y-DNA test is coming back with a Native American haplogroup. That supports what we know from colonialism. That's what supports what we know from the archive, for sure. So I could, let me just take this one. Can you speak on why the name Rael was passed down by Juliana Rael, a mother of Alonso, said to be the progenitor of the Raels in New Mexico, from Origins of New Mexico book? the poetic, status, caste, common theme from other surnames here. Okay. So this is a little bit off topic from what I'm discussing, but my predecessor, Stan Horties, who was also the state historian of New Mexico, his work is all on Sephardic Jewish ancestry. And a remarkable book that he wrote that is called To the Ends of the Earth, I think. So there are different origins to the name. Some people have argued that it comes from Israel, so connecting it to a Jewish. I've never seen a document that proves that. So I'm a pragmatist historian in that way, that I have to see the document. But here's what we also know of that, the Raels actually, there's a document that I saw, I think from the 1400s, if I remember correct, that the only evidence that we have that shows any connection that they weren't, that they might have been something else. It says, al hijo de Rael que se tornó a ser cristiano. The son of the Rael who converted and changed into being, but those Raels, not my expertise at all, were from Lorca, southern province of Spain. But let me tell you who lived in Lorca in the southern province of Spain. Not just Jewish people, Arabic people as well, Moorish people. So for me, all kinds of people were being converted at that time because they were being forced to be converted. So I read that and I would argue with Stan and say, that could be either, right? And it could be. So, and here's the other thing with Stan's work is incredible, but it's a fraction. It's a small fraction. And you're seeing this in the DNA. So there was a movement, there was a drive of people drawn to identify their Jewish ancestors. Look at what the DNA says. Anyone who does that, if you do like a broad general one, 1%. How much is the DNA for Native Americans coming back? You said it a while. Just for you.
38.
38.
And Jewish is 2%.
Yeah, so I used to tell Stan, you'll find one Jewish ancestor in that family tree. I'll find you 50 indigenous people, right? And I'm not, it's not just boastful. We were arguing. But you know, but here's the thing, it's part of our ancestry. It's like of those 2,000 people that we invited into the courtyard, one of those, that's part of the story for sure, right? But I think people's drive to recover that story is part, I hope that they would be as interested in the most marginalized, who are these indigenous people in this landscape, right? Okay, yes.
This is my last question.
Wait,
So
okay.
is your project here, this indigenous slavery project, kind of exclusive to the Southwest area, or are you expanding it throughout the U.S.?
The America. No, the Americas, the hemispheric. So when I showed you that map a while ago of, so I have a team member working in Paraguay, I have a team member working in Brazil, I have someone in Canada. If I could have someone in every single municipality throughout the Americas, I would, because we need that. But we have people working in at least, 6, 7 countries right now. So not just even the US. And in terms of what is now considered the US, we have people working in Florida to California, Alaska to Texas, so all over.
So it's 7:35.
Oh, see, we still have 30 minutes.
Finish the questions on the pink cards before we take second questions from the.
You put a note here?
I put it on your laptop.
Okay, let's see.
Is
A note.
that okay if we just take first questions from the pink cards before we take second questions?
There's an advertisement, I think, yes? A note that your successor, as state historian Rick Hendricks, is speaking tomorrow at the Witches of Abiquiu Taos County Historical Society. I'm sorry,
Is that
you
okay
asked
for
something.
If we finish these before we take second questions?
Sure, I think I've actually
then
finished them. So
check in.
that's done. That's
I just want
done.
everyone to trust that they get a turn with a
Looking
question
for
at least once.
that's done. If all New Mexico, okay, there's part of that's not done. This one's done. This one's done. This one's done. I think they're all done except this last one, where someone asks, and what is the reaction of Indigenous nations to your project? So we have team members who are working with us already from various Indigenous nations. Now here's the thing with, if we're working with people who are from, thank you for coming, folks. Take care. So if they're working from places like Peru or Mexico, a lot of tribal sovereignty was erased. So those, unlike the US where we have recognized tribal nations, not for every community, some are still fighting for that in places like California, but in places like Mexico, those like the Otomi people, it's not a sovereign nation, but we're still endeavoring to work with those various communities. In terms of what people think about it, I've heard all positive in terms of the communities that have begun to work with us. Here's an interesting thing that has emerged though. As I talk to reporters or other potential partners about the project, one of the very first things that happens is that people immediately say, are you working with the tribes? And so the answer is yes, we are. But I to one reporter, I said, would you ever ask that same, if I were African American working in California or Virginia or wherever, and I was working to recover the history of African American slavery in the US, would you ask if I were working with the tribes? And he paused and said, no, I hadn't thought about that. So there is a different standard that's being used in terms of focusing on indigenous slavery from African American slavery. You know, those tribes are across the Atlantic Ocean, right? So they're in Africa. But I think the difference is here is that there are tribes that exist throughout tribal indigenous communities that exist throughout the Americas, including in places like New Mexico, where there are still sovereign tribes. But you know, I think about this as there's a community of origin where a person could have been taken from the Diné Navajo Nation or Comanche or Apache, and someone lost a son, a daughter, a sister, or a brother, and those people who were left behind, they have descendants. But those people who were taken became the ancestors in other communities, right? And that's true of any slave regime, right? That's true of any slave regime, right? That if you are working with African American communities who live anywhere here in New Mexico or Virginia or wherever, there's a tribe that lost someone who became the ancestor of that person that lives here. And there's a lot more complexity to this, but that's how we start to break this apart and try to understand why there seems to be a double standard when people interrogate this. But there's not been a lot of interrogation. There's been more support than anything else. Okay, that was all those questions, I think. We still have 20 minutes. We're gonna work this out right now. Okay, should we start signing people up to like transcribe and translate and stuff? Kidding, not really, but.
I have a question, if no one. Women. When you first started speaking about the enslaved people, you focused so much on women's names, women. And I'm curious about this intersection between misogyny or patriarchy here and racism. And I'm curious about what percentage of these indigenous slaves were women, and what was particular specific to the lives of women slaves?
The question is about women in the records. I started speaking about women and using a lot of women's names. And even when I showed the slide of this household and the various networks, I think there was probably 1 or 2 male names in there. Most of the names were female names. And so I don't have an exact percent. And so the question was, what is the percentage of females versus males in this entire slave trade? And it's going to vary, I think, across geographies. That's what the project will reveal. Eventually, say, like whatever, 10 years from now or 20 years from now, we have documented millions of people in there. We'll be able to say 20% of them are male and whatever, 80% of them female. We'll actually be able to precisely answer that question. But just off the top of my head in New Mexico, the reason why there are more females, one, they didn't run away. And most of the people that were being taken were children, right? So it was easier to take female children than it was to take male children, according to those who were doing the capturing at the time. And they were, there were several documents that pointed to the fact that male children often ran away easier than female children. And so, but it was because it was not later on, later after the 1700s, we start to see that the slave regime in places like New Mexico was not governed by large plantation economies. There were early encomiendas and there were plantations early on. That's why I say that. After the 1700s, it was more of a householding institution. The labor that was being required was primarily around the household. Not entirely, because there were herders, but that didn't mean that females weren't doing the herding, but generally they weren't being identified as that in the record. But the percentage of females to males is much higher in New Mexico for those reasons, I think. They were much more valuable as well. So they were able to trade in that barter economy in that way. Let me ask.
What was the involvement of the Puebloans in slave holding?
That's a good question. And so some of that, there were other plains groups like Apache, Comanche that were captured and held and sold and traded within Pueblo communities. So, but documenting that is a little bit harder, but those communities also have church records. So as we start to go through records at Isleta or Jemez or wherever, we're actually starting to document that a little bit more, and hopefully soon can actually answer that question with more clarity. Yes?
What was the ending date of indigenous slavery in this area, and did it have anything to do with chattel slavery then?
Uh-oh, the boss is here.
Go ahead. I just came
Can you finish?
Yeah, I said, what was the ending time frame, years, that you would consider the end of indigenous slavery? And did it have anything to do with chattel slavery's end?
Very good question. So those in the other room, what was the ending point that I can think of for indigenous slavery, and in what way does that relate to, I don't use chattel slavery anymore because I use African-American slavery. How does that correlate, the ending point for indigenous slavery, and how that correlates with African-American slavery? So African-American slavery, as we know, ended with the Civil War, right? So the Emancipation Proclamation legally ended that, but not really, right? Because the Reconstruction, all of it just morphed into something else. So the name, they weren't being called slaves anymore, but they were still doing the labor. So it continued. It's not so different with indigenous slavery either. But I meant, so when Andrew Johnson, he didn't do exactly a proclamation ending indigenous slaveries in the territories, but he put out an edict asking the Indian agents to end the practice. And so that's where that list came from. 3 years later, 1868, they bring in a whole new individual to actually interrogate this. He creates a grand jury. I mentioned this, at one of the places where he charges men and some women with holding enslaved people was in Taos County. 290 individuals were actually charged, 1868. That's odd for people. It should have ended, right, in 1865 when that edict was passed. But here's what I know. 1870, they're still being listed as servants in the household. Same people that I've traced as being captured and identified in the baptismal records. 1880, they're still being there. Same ones, same households. Now the former enslavers, their sons or daughters are living in that household and they're taking care of them. We don't have the 1890 census, unfortunately burned completely in the US, so we don't have that census. 1900, they're still there. All the way to 1950, San Luis, Colorado, I traced Guadalupe Gallegos, who is in Dario Gallegos' household. She's now 3 generations removed from Dario, who left her from one son to the next son. So the last captivities were taking place in the 1880s. The people were still being held in these households into the 1950s. So I wanted to start just thinking about this, or the way I think about it poetically, but I think it's true on the ground. I like one of my favorite poets, Borges, reflected on the last person who knew Jesus Christ and when they last closed their eyes. I think, when was the last person that had been captured and enslaved? When did they close their eyes? I reflect on this a little bit when I'm writing about a man from Conejos in San Luis Valley who died in Denver in 1847. But I say he's part of a larger landscape where men and women were slowly closing their eyes, right? And so, but we're their heirs. You had a...
Yeah, so my question is, so yeah, we understand there's slavery and the term, kind of brings, sort of an ugly side to it, but in some cases where, the slave did, like on Severino Martinez, Maria, I read that he gave her a couple liñas, which is some land. And so was it common that maybe some of the slaves, their quality of life was so good or better than maybe what they felt they would have had trying to make it on their own, and could that have been why some of them stayed rather than slavery had ended and they didn't leave, or was it common for the slave owners to deed them land in their will of death?
So Daniel opens up a conversation that is going to keep us here for another 30 minutes. In terms of how we start to imagine the lives of the enslaved, was their life better in their enslaver's household? I'm going to answer the last question that you ended on easier, and then I'm going to come back to this one. But was it common for those who had captured and held them in their households to leave them items in their last will and testament? Yes, it was common. Well, I don't know if it was common. We're going to trace how common it was, but we have many examples of individuals who are leaving their indigenous enslaved people pieces of land or part of a house. In about 1740, if I remember the date correctly, it certainly was the mid-1700s, a man by the name of Antonio Gurule in Bernalillo writes up his last will and testament. And he identifies Rosa and Elena, who were the Indias who belonged to his mother, that now belong to me. And he says, at the time of my death, they will be free as they were from the day they were born. And I leave them una milpa, so that they can take care of their families. So when I think about individuals like that, or the Marias, there were 3 Marias that Severino had in his household. I've tried to imagine where their lives were. It's hard for us. Those of us who historians, we do interpret and we imagine what those lives would have been like. We have to imagine what their lives would have been like. It's true that, you know, the stigma and the labor of living in those households, we don't know. We know that they were doing the labor. We know that they were raising the children. But what it felt like to them, we can only imagine, right? If you imagine not knowing whether your mother or father or your grandparent, being severed from your ancestry completely, not being able to think about that. I mean, those are the things I think about. Like, what did Maria, as she moved between these walls, what did she imagine her life might have been had she not been taken? At the time that she was living, she was earlier than someone like Rosario, but there was continuous warfare. Some of those enslaved people would go on to say, I think I am better off. Of that list that I showed of the 149, only a handful said that they wanted to return, something like 12 that they wished to return. Now, what I don't know is, how did you ask the question? Did you ask the little girl there that was 5 years old? Or did you ask the man who was in charge of her? Like, what agency did she have to make that decision? What I do know is, because it showed up in a record 7 years later, 7 women escaped and died in the snow, escaping from the San Luis area. We don't know. All we can do is look at the records, imagine what their life might have been like. That's our responsibility as people trying to remember them. Now, what I also know, I don't want to end so, I mean, this is a traumatic story. It's affected us to the very core. But the fact that I know there's all of the Nuevo Mexicanos in this room, you descend from that. I know you do. And maybe others of you who came from other places also descend from it. I mean, Orlando Patterson says that there's not a single person alive who does not descend from an enslaver and an enslaved person. I think that's true, just because the phenomenon affected us globally. But the fact that you are here means that she or he survived, right? And that you were left here to survive that. So for me, it speaks to the resilience. I think of the work, I think of a metaphor. I'll end here so I can let you guys go. The metaphor that defines so much of this work are aspen trees. I love aspen trees because they're part of our geography. They're part of our landscape. And I think of them, what I call my 3 R's. As those of you who know, there's one root system, right? It looks like individual trees on a mountain, but they're interconnected by one root system. That's us, right? We're interconnected. Whether you identify as Pueblo, whether you identify as Spanish, Hispano, Chicano, you're a tree. You're an aspen tree, and it's one root system that interconnects us. The aspen trees, what they have done is they heal the mountain. Once it's burned up, they're like regenerate. I think like that fire is what ravaged a community through colonialism and slavery. But the aspen trees come up to heal it. So it's about resilience. And that's what those individuals who lived through these experiences were. They were resilient, like those aspen trees. And finally, the third R is radiance. Because if you look at those aspen trees up on this Taos mountain, you see those quaking leaves, which is how they refer to the leaves when they shimmer in that way. That's us too. All of that wisdom is passed down, those stories, and that's us too. The roots, resilience, and radiance. That's who our community is, through the good and through the bad. And we just have to remember them whole. So.
Thank you, Mr. Gálvez. That was awesome. Thank you all for coming again and being a part of this, and we look forward to seeing your faces again at our next lecture, which is, we don't have it written down, but it's in 2 weeks. It'll be here, same place, same time.
Art historian.
Ray
Hernandez Duran.
Thank you for our YouTube viewers who showed up and watched the show, and to Miss Anita, all the Coalicion staff and volunteers that showed up to put this together. Have a safe drive home, and thank you again. All right, that was awesome.